Dear participants, I welcome you all to the second session of day 4 of this faculty development program on damage tolerance, a new design strategy. Today we have with us Mr. Sagar Chandra, who is a scientist in BRC. And I would like to give his brief introduction to you in the beginning. Mr. Sagar Chandra is Scientific Officer E in the Refueling Technology Division, RTD, in BARC, Baba Atomic Research Center, since August 2011. He is a mechanical engineer from the 55th batch of BARC Training School. He joined the Reactor Technology Division in August 2012 and completed his MTech work in September 2013. He is currently enrolled for PhD through Homi Bhabha National Institute on the topic, a multi-scale model for simulation of plastic deformation behavior of nickel-based alloy with explicit consideration of the effect of grain boundaries as a part of divisional 12th plan activity that is on mechanics of failure in ductile materials. His areas of expertise include multi-scale modeling of deformation behavior of crystalline metals and alloys using numerical simulation tools at different length and time scale. During the past few years, he has been involved in analysis of plasticity evaluation from various grain boundaries in ductile metals using molecular dynamics simulations, simulating deformation response of polycrystalline materials using crystal plasticity finite element analysis, study of deformation behavior involving dislocation grain boundary interactions and transferring relevant parameters to higher length scale models, numerical simulations involving finite element analysis of polyurethane foam lead-filled nuclear shipping casks under regulatory drop events, and experimental characterization of high strain rate material properties of various metals and alloys under uniaxial compression using split Hopkinson pressure bar. He has published his work in 20 international journals of repute and has also presented in various national and international conferences in the country. He is currently involved in testing the data analysis of high strain rate tests on various metallic and polymer based materials and simulation of deformation behavior of polycrystalline metals and alloys using multi-scale model involving molecular dynamics and crystal plasticity based finite element methods. So, we have today such a distinct personality, who is doing the state-of-the-art research on multi-scale modeling related to material mechanics. And in the context of the title of our faculty development program, I am sure it is going to take us to another boundary where you will be able to see a new world outside the domain. With this brief introduction, may I request you, Mr. Sagar Chandra, to start your session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible, sir? Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, so I should share my content now, share my screen, right?
Yes. You can keep your camera on if you want.
I will just. Is it visible?
Yeah, it's coming. Yeah, it's visible now.
Yeah, okay. Good morning, everybody. Today I will be delivering on mechanisms of failure and damage at the atomic level. And I belong, as sir has already introduced me, I am from the Refueling Technology Division, Bhabha Atomic Research Center. I'm really pleased to be here because of two reasons basically. First, it is really quite amazing that the mechanics of ductile materials, failure in ductile materials and fracture, it has now encompassed different length and time scales, and the numerical simulations and analysis that we perform at our facility, they are also helping in designing damage tolerant products. And secondly, I was invited to deliver an expert talk around 3.5 years ago at this same very institute, VJTI. And at that it was around January 2018. And just 3 months prior to that, we had developed a multi-scale simulation methodology to predict the plastic deformation behavior of engineering metals using molecular dynamics, crystal plasticity, and dislocation dynamics. And so soon after 3 months, I got a chance to present that work at VJTI. And now also I have got a chance, and it's quite amused. I would like to tell you that just 4 months back, we have developed another multi-scale methodology to predict the deformation behavior, including the effect of grain boundaries also, which are inherent microstructural features of polycrystalline metals, engineering metals. And happily, I will be presenting that work also, so it's quite amazing. So mechanisms of failure and damage at atomic level. This is my brief outline. Is it visible? Sachin sir, hello?
Yes, it is visible.
Yes.
Okay. So I will right away start from introduction, where I will right away start by showing some images where damage occurs in polycrystalline metals, engineering metals, and from that on basic mechanisms of material damage, and I will then introduce you to different length scales and the associated modeling techniques. Then I will show some motivation to study failure and damage at the atomic scales of inception. From that, we will move on to higher length scale crystal plasticity models, their predictions on the material failure and damage behavior. And finally, because of the content of this talk, I will focus mainly on the molecular dynamic simulations, which are used worldwide and which we have also used for predictions of failure and damage, and how those simulations can inform higher length scale models, because that is what is most important. And these simulations, okay, they are one thing, but how those lower scale simulations can inform engineering level judgments, that is most important, and that I will show how it can be done. This right away, as I said, I will start from some basic observations of damage. This is a scanning electron microscopy images in steel, which is most commonly used material. Uniaxial tension was applied to this material, and as you can see, because of plastic deformation, dislocation pile up at the grain boundaries, damage was introduced at the grain boundaries. This study was published in Engineering Fracture Mechanics in 2019, so it is a latest one. I'm just showing some evidences of where and how damage develops during or post deformation. Then this is another study published in the same journal in 2013, where we can see, here you can see like the grain boundary voids, the existence of voids at the grain boundaries, which after deformation lead to catastrophic failure of the material. These are the scanning electron microscopy images, again, the same material. And you can see the voids, prevalence of pre-existing voids at the grain boundaries. Another study from Pradhan in the fractural structural integrity in 2012. You can see this is an initial scanning electron micrograph, and it shows the presence of damage at grain interiors. See these small holes. Are they visible, and are you able to see my mouse pointer?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sir, okay.
Mouse pointer, although is very small, can you make it red in color or something?
I don't know how to make that. It will take a time. So if it is okay, then I can. Yeah.
No, it's okay. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So this is an SEM micrograph of mild steel, which shows initial damage at grain boundaries as well as bulk grains. And this is another study published in ACTA. And you can see the crack propagation through grain boundaries. So that is an intergranular fracture mode. So all these 4 images that I have shown, clearly they show that the occurrence of damage, either it is whether it is pre-existing or it is post-deformation, they occur through certain material defects which are present in the engineering materials. Now, and from plastic deformation, these basic mechanisms of damage can be figured out. First of all, if you consider this is a very simple picture that I have put, and you can think of this hexagon as a crystal, and the boundary between these hexagon is grain boundaries, and the internal hexagon, the lines which are shown, you just consider them as dislocations. So simply you deform the material over the time, the dislocation density in the material is increased, and this increase in dislocation density with time leads to initiation of damage either at the grain boundaries or within the bulk grains. This is one possible mechanism of damage. Another possible mechanism is related to if some cavities, some blowholes, some pinholes are present at the grain boundary, and during deformation with time, the concentration of these blowholes increases. This may happen mostly at high temperatures because of vacancy diffusion. That is quite, it is quite known, it is quite traditional. Another mechanism of damage, these blowholes or pinholes or even the voids at the grain boundaries, they grow with time. Again, this will happen at grain boundaries and at very high stresses or at high temperatures. These are very simple mechanisms of damage which prove catastrophic finally. And again, the previous slides were related to grain boundaries, but the damage can be also occurring in the pre-existing in grains also. So these black holes, they can be present in the grains, and with the deformation during straining, the volume fraction of this may increase, and that may particularly lead to damage. Another possible, in conjunction with grain boundary sliding, suppose at higher temperatures, if you are applying load at higher stresses and at higher temperatures, then the grain boundary sliding and the intergranular damage, that may take a key role. So they may play a role in damaging the material in conjunction. So these are the basic mechanisms of material damage, and it can be summarized from this flow chart below. The damage can occur through plastic deformation due to dislocation motion, the first slide that I showed you. Then second, due to twinning. Remember, this twinning is not annealing twins, because annealing twins are generally formed during heat treatment of the material. So these are mostly deformation twins, which are formed during the deformation of the material. Then damage may occur due to phase transformation also. In some materials of different crystal structures, like we have hexagonal closed pack materials like zirconium, magnesium alloys. So there are not available slip systems are not enough to take the energy because of plastic deformation. So these materials tend to deform through, in addition to dislocation motion, twinning, as well as phase transformation, particularly at higher strain rates, particularly at impact loading. So phase transformation can also play a key role in damaging the material. Then grain boundary sliding that I have shown in the previous slide, that may occur at higher temperatures. This is mostly prevalent at higher temperatures and very less, it is very less significant at low temperatures. Again, at higher temperatures, vacancy diffusion can occur, and which may lead ultimately to growth of voids and dislocation climb. This is also mostly prevalent in higher temperatures and mostly related to phenomena of edge dislocations. Then fracture, fatigue, these are very traditional. I won't go much into deep, and creep also. Then microstructure changes may occur during loading, like I just said, twinning during loading. This is deformation twinning, not the annealing twins. And what twins mostly do is they do two things. Firstly, they change the grain size of the material. So the grain size of the material reduces, and therefore the dislocation mean free path reduces. So this causes a change in the ductility of the material. The material may harden during deformation, and that may lead to crack initiation in some places where the strength of the material is low. Then phase transformations, as I've already told you, occurs mostly in materials of BCC and HCP crystal structure, where the available slip systems are not enough to take the plastic deformation into consideration. Then grain growth, obviously, this occurs at higher temperature, or particle coarsening, again, if the material is allowed to deform at higher temperature for a considerable period of time. Physical degradation, this is mostly a very common phenomena, but our main focus is FDP, damage tolerant design. I believe it is related to deformation of the material. So plastic deformation and microstructure changes during loading. I will just summarize what I told in few lines here, and I don't believe they require much interpretation. That the physical process of failure in ductile materials involves sequence of nucleation, growth, and coalescence of small internal voids. And nucleation of voids can either occur through decohesion of second phase particles or from evolution of vacancy clusters, which are already present in the material, which are inevitable. They're always there. And upon the application of load and the concomitant plasticity evolution in the matrix, it leads to plastic localization in the ligament between the voids. This leads to onset of void coalescence, and consequently, the voids grow until complete ligament rupture. Very basic phenomena. I have tried to explain it in as easy as possible. So what the takeaway from up till now is that the void nucleation, the damage or the fracture or the failure of the material, it occurs at certain material defects which are already there, like grain boundaries or phase boundaries or second phase particles. And with respect to fracture, these defects can either assist in damaging the material, or they can assist in increasing the toughness of the material. They can arrest the crack, or they can in fact contribute to crack growth resistance when the fracture occurs mostly in transgranular fracture. So what I want to emphasize upon here is that the failure, the damage, the fracture phenomena, it is spanning over a realm of different length and time scales. So it is a multi-scale phenomena, that therefore we believe that the problem cannot be treated in the realm of a single length scale or time scale. And therefore capturing these processes using multi-scale predictive methods is imperative. And that's what we are going to do here. That's what we are going to look, how people capture it through multi-scale models with particular emphasis on molecular dynamics, the atomistic details. So this length scale, this is a basic picture how failure of materials can be treated at different length and time scales. At the atomic level, where you consider certain portion of atoms or collection of atoms as discrete entities, then comes the mesoscopic level, where the large number of millions and billions of atoms form different grains and grain boundaries, and finally you have the continuum structure. And therefore, depending upon these disparate length scales, we have different simulation and modeling and analysis tools. At the microscopic level, we have molecular dynamics. At the mesoscopic level, we have crystal plasticity, and at the macroscopic level, as we are well aware, we have continuum plasticity, continuum mechanics. Now, our main aim is to link these three scales so we have a physically justified view of the damage and failure behavior of the material. This is another way of showing the disparate length and time scales, where we have simulation at the macroscopic level. We apply some boundary conditions, we compare it with the experiments at macroscopic level. You go a scale down below, you have different grains where different anisotropic behavior comes into picture. This is the way to view different grains in a scanning electron microscope. You go further down, you have a discrete collection of dislocations, and this is a TEM bright field image, which is showing the collective behavior of dislocations. You go further down, you have a collection of atoms, and this is atomic force microscopy images where you can see the atoms. You go further down, we have ab initio structure, where the Schrodinger wave equation, density functional theory, all these things come into account. I have not worked on this ab initio, but I have worked on all these 4 length scales which are shown above this. So it is quite amusing that how these length scales can connect, and if they are connected properly, how they can inform our judicious choice of designing tougher materials or designing ductile materials or designing good materials through grain boundary engineering for damage tolerant design. So I will just quickly go through this different length and time scales a little bit more in detail. First, we have at the lowest possible scale, we have ab initio methods, which calculate the properties of material from first principle, like Schrodinger wave equations, solve the quantum mechanical equations. Their advantage is that they govern the behavior and they provide the behavior based on the electronic structure of the matter, and they can handle different processes which involve bond breaking, formation, or even electronic arrangement between atoms of a metal. And they can, in principle, obtain essentially exact properties without any, artificial input to the system, but only the arrangement of atoms depending on the crystal structure of the material, whether it is FCC, whether it is BCC, whether it is HCP or anything. But they cannot handle relatively large systems because of huge computational cost that is involved in them. And therefore comes the molecular dynamics level, the atomistic methods, which are used to handle the behavior of a large number of atoms. And with increase in computational power today, we can collectively simulate a behavior of even billions of atoms. So that is quite good. So they can study dynamical processes on a comparatively longer length and time scales as compared to the ab initio methods. This is just the image that I've shown. This is taken from our publication. It is the growth of an initial void present in single crystal of copper. And you can see that dislocations are emitted from this. I'm presenting this result anyway in the future slides, so there we will go much in detail. But the limitations of atomistic methods is the results depend on the quality of interatomic potential. This interatomic potential is coming from the previous lower length scale, the ab initio method. And depending on the quality of that interatomic potential, our molecular dynamic simulation results arrive. So if you are using a potential, suppose that is not able to, just in case, for example, it does not quantify the stacking fault energy of the material precisely, then you should not apply that potential to study the phenomena of dislocation nucleation in metals at the atomistic level. Because dislocation nucleation, the dislocation splits into partials with a stacking fault between them. So if your potential is not predicting good stacking fault energy, you should not use that potential for predicting the behavior related to dislocation. So this is just a one-to-one phenomena. Use the potential which fits best to predict what you want. And another limitation is, again, every simulation tool has a limitation that it cannot access length and time scales which are out of the range of it. So we have another length and time scales, that is mesoscale methods, crystal plasticity based methods. I am skipping here dislocation dynamics. They come in between MD and crystal plasticity. But because our talk is related to molecular dynamics, and mostly I will be focusing on that. So I will just give a brief overview of crystal plasticity, and then we will focus on molecular dynamics. And then we will see how this molecular dynamics can predict the damage and they can inform judicious choices to have good materials. So mesoscale methods, they introduce simplifications to atomistic methods to treat blobs of matter as individual entities. Their advantages, they can study structural features of complex systems. The image that I've shown here, this is a single crystal copper. It was initially 4 by 4 mm length cylinder, and upon dynamic compression, see the initial cross section which was circular has now deformed into an oval shape. This you cannot expect when you are deforming a completely isotropic material. This is only possible in single crystals because the plastic deformation behavior of single crystals is direction dependent. And see the finite element method predictions. So these results are matching well. We have published this in Journal of Applied Physics in 2014. But the limitation of these methods, they require again information from lower length scale simulations. Otherwise, you have to just do curve fitting to match your simulation data to the experimental data, and therefore they have more approximations than lower length scale methods. Then from crystal plasticity methods, we have another final scale which we are very well aware of, that is the continuum methods, which assume that matter is continuous and treat the properties of system as field quantities, and they evolve with time. Their advantage is very obvious. They can handle large systems of any macroscopic domain and dynamic process. However, the disadvantage is that they do not take into account the effect of microstructure on the material behavior. And now we have seen in the previous slides how microstructure plays a key role in determining the damage and failure behavior of the material. So we just don't use anymore. I mean, I personally don't use any more continuum methods to predict the deformation behavior, especially when we have fracture or damage involved. So, for example, take a simple example of a bar. You are deforming a bar in tension. That is a uniaxial case. The initial length of the bar is L, and you're deforming it by delta. Your strain will be delta upon L, and your stress, what we are predicting, if you do not take any microstructural variable into account, your stress will be a function of strain only. But if I go a little bit deeper, I want to include one microstructural feature, that is dislocation density, rho. So my stress will be a function of strain and dislocation density. And correspondingly, I can explain my stress strain curve based on the initial density of dislocation. So initially within the elastic regime, the dislocation density was fairly low. And as I cross the yield point, as the material deforms, the dislocation density inside the material increases. So my stress will be a function of dislocation density and the continuum variables, strain rate, and temperature. Like we have a Johnson-Cook model. There we only take into account the effect of strain rate, and temperature. Similarly, we have Johnson-Cook damage model. These are continuum-based models. But if I want to introduce additional complexity to make my design more tougher and more good, I will introduce one microstructural feature, say dislocation density. I want to go further deep. I will introduce another microstructure feature, damage. So my stress will now be a function of strain and damage. The macroscopic definition of strain is same, and now my damage will be the internal state variable that will evolve with the deformation. And I can explain my stress strain behavior fairly on that also. I mean, we have initial damage less in the elastic regime. As I go into the plastic deformation regime, the amount of damage goes on increasing. And my stress is a function of strain rate, at temperatures, the macroscopic variable, and the internal damage, the internal state variable. Introduce additional complexity if you want. My stress is a function of strain rate, temperature, dislocation density, as well as damage. You will have more robust and more good design of your material. So it depends on you that how comprehensive the design of the material ought to be. Inclusion of lower length scale processes will always bring more reliability in design. This is just one figure of titanium 6 aluminum 4 vanadium alloy, and I just want to show it here to show the effect of porosity in the material. Like if you are not including the effect of porosities, and if you include the effect of porosities, how the stress strain curve and the ductility of the material changes significantly. So it is quite imperative, it is quite important to introduce these features in our continuum-based phenomenological models, so that we have a more robust and more comprehensive design for structural engineering applications. This is just a figure I've taken. I like this figure because it just summarizes everything that I have shown till now. The basic characteristics, the basic length scales, and the associated properties. Like at the very smaller length scale, we have the crystal lattice that can be body-centered cubic, for example, iron-based materials, face-centered cubic, for example, nickel or copper-based materials, or stacking fault energy and bond energy. I go to a higher level, then I have the microstructure of the material where I have different phases. These are mostly prevalent in alloys. For example, nickel-based alloys, they have gamma prime phases. This is just one example. Then I have grain size of the material, because Grain size also plays a key role in governing the deformation behavior and damage behavior. Then I have the initial texture, which is very, very important, especially if my material is initially rolled, or if it is a type of sheet metal, because the prevalence of texture, if it is not random, if it is random texture, then okay, my properties are isotropic, I can apply my continuum model. But if the texture is not random and is some preferred texture, then my material properties and the deformation behavior is subject to change. It will definitely change. Or the presence of inclusions or other defects, that is quite normal, quite traditional. And the defects may be pores, inclusions, or even surface damage. The damage may occur at bulk grains, grain boundaries, or even at the surface. Depending on the phenomena, if one or two phenomena is prevalent, or if all the phenomena are prevalent, these govern the stiffness, the strength, the ductility, the crack growth resistance, the under monotonic as well as cyclic loading, as well as the fatigue strength of the material. So almost all properties which are related to engineering materials, they are governed by the features which are occurring at lower length and time scales, which ultimately are reflected in the measurable parameters which we get from experiments. What? Like Young's modulus, Poisson's ratio, yield strength, UTS, name it, strain hardening exponent, fracture strain, upper, lower shelf temperature, SN curve, fatigue limit, etc., etc. So this whole slide must summarize, and I believe I'm quite clear that how the failure mechanical processes occurring at a lower length scale govern the dynamics at higher length scale. Consequently, we have the multi-scale approach to materials modeling. You want from an ab initio level, anyway, which we are not doing. So we have molecular dynamics at the nanometer and picoseconds. We go up one level, we have dislocation dynamics simulations. We go up another level, we have crystal plasticity simulation. We go up another level, we have continuum plasticity structure, where the length scales and the time scales are of the order of seconds and meters. Now, why do we require such modeling schemes? I have already told, because the mechanical properties are extremely essential to the quality of products, and our preference is on designing materials which are effective. And for these, we use effective modeling in design in virtual environments. This is just a figure, a cylindrical figure of single crystal copper that I just showed previously around 4 or 5 slides back. And this is a polycrystalline copper. So here the cube, the different colors in this cube represent different grains of different orientations, because polycrystalline materials contain a myriad of randomly oriented crystals. So in order to capture the behavior of these single crystals as well as polycrystals, we cannot use continuum based models. We have to rely on those models which are mesoscale level and take the effect of microstructure into account. And hence we have different crystal plasticity models. And in order to take into account the behavior of polycrystalline metals, we need to first take into account the behavior of single crystals, how the slip is occurring in single crystals, how the dislocation phenomena is occurring in single crystals. Then go introduce additional complexities, introduce additional microstructural features like grain boundaries. You see how the dislocations are interacting with grain boundaries, what are the governing dynamics, what is the governing laws. Then you introduce phase boundaries, you see how the phenomena is occurring, and so on and so forth. There is no end to it. You can introduce twins, you introduce damage, phase transformation, or even like dynamic recrystallization. There are many phenomena. So now what I will do is I will just, having given a brief overview of damage, how it occurs at the lower length and time scales, and how they govern the material behavior at larger scales, I will now provide a brief overview of the models which are used to predict the damage. What I am doing here is I will now just derive the flow route, in the simplest possible manner of crystal plasticity based models, because I have now shown that continuum based models, okay, they must be doing well right now, but in order to have a damage tolerant design or failure tolerant design, we need to take into account the effect of microstructure. Effective microstructure means we need microstructure based models. So I will now be deriving a simple microstructure based models of deformation behavior, and then I will show you how those microstructure based models are used to predict the damage and failure tolerant behavior, and finally how it can be linked to lower length scale models. So crystal plasticity, just an overview, and I will just simply read it, that the behavior at macro scale is governed by underlying structure, and crystal plasticity links the mechanical behavior to key microstructure features. Description of the theory is based on single crystal, the deformation mode, the deformation that occurs on this particular slip systems. I will just briefly introduce what are slip systems, because I believe most of the audience present here is aware what are slip systems, the combination of slip planes and slip directions. And the stress is needed to initiate plastic deformation, which we call the critical result shear stress, governed by the Schmidt's law. Then during deformation, the crystal may reorient texture. And for aggregate of polycrystal, we have stress strain curves and the display of orientation of texture in the form of pole figures. This is just simple phenomena. If you crystal plasticity phenomena, you apply a uniaxial load on a material, it will be resolved into different components along the different slip planes as well as slip directions. You resolve that load, we called it the resolved shear stress, and the relation between the resolved shear stress tau r and the macroscopic applied stress sigma, we call it the Schmidt law. Now I will show you from this basic Schmidt law how we can derive the flow rule of crystal plasticity based models, which can be used to predict the damage behavior of materials. Now, what is the condition of dislocation motion? This resolved shear stress must be greater than some resistance which the crystal imposes. Now, different crystals have different resistances to plastic deformation. When I say plastic deformation, let us keep it simple and we keep our focus only on dislocation motion. So the condition for dislocation motion is the tau r, the resolved shear stress must be greater than the Pierce stress. What is the Pierce stress? That depends on core structure of the dislocation, and because it depends on dislocation core structure, it does not have a unique analytical expression. Pierce stress, I should tell you, for face-centered cubic materials, the Pierce stress is quite low. However, the Pierce stress is quite significant for body-centered cubic and hexagonal closed-packed materials. It plays a very, very important role in those materials. So, condition for dislocation motion is my resolved shear stress must be greater than the resistance. That's it, as simple as that. This is one expression of the Pierce stress. That 2G is the shear modulus, mu is the Poisson's ratio. However, what should be noted here is that the Pierce stress tau is dependent on the width of plane, the width between the planes, and the spacing among the plane. So, in order to have a low Pierce stress, you should have a closely packed planes and closely packed directions. So that's why we have seen that the slip occurs mostly on close packed planes and close packed directions. For face-centered cubic materials and alloys like FCC-based structure like nickel, copper, or aluminum-based alloys, the closed packed planes are 111 type planes, and the closed packed directions are 110 type directions. However, for body-centered cubic materials, it's exactly the opposite. The closed packed planes are 110 type planes and the closed packed directions are 111 type directions. So it depends on the crystal structure of the material. And the combination of these slip planes and the slip directions, we refer to it as a slip system, as I told previously. This is one basic example of face-centered cubic material. Face-centered cubic material, 8 atoms at the edges and 6 atoms at the face corners. And the 111 packed plane, if you see it from the top, you will see like this. Each atom will be surrounded by 6 other atoms. So it is the most closely packed plane. So 111 type plane is the most packed, closely packed plane, having the most dense atomic packing, and the slip direction is 110 in face-centered cubic material. So dislocation motion, which involves breaking and deformation of bonds, and it costs energy to the crystal. And the energy of the crystal depend on the Burger's vector of the dislocations. E equals to half GB square. So if you want less energy, the Burger's vector of the dislocation must be minimized. Now the dislocations in FCC, for example, they are 110 type. So in order to minimize the 110 type Burger's vector, the dislocation tends to split into partial dislocations of 112 type Burger's vector, and the partial dislocations have an associated stacking fault between them. So dislocations in FCC metals, they occur on 111 planes in 110 directions. The shortest lattice Burger vector is 110, and therefore the Burger vector is of A by 2 110 type. A is the equilibrium lattice constant of the material. For example, for copper it will be 3.615, for aluminum 4.05 angstrom, and so on. So because of this dislocation motion, the free energy of the crystal may increase at least locally or temporarily, and therefore there is always a resistance to dislocation motion. Now we will call it the glide resistance tau. This tau is 1 upon V, the change in free energy of the crystal per unit applied strain. Now what will overcome this glide resistance tau? Obviously our external work sigma. The V is the local volume, which is the local volume under consideration. W is the external work per unit applied strain. So simply from these two equations, what we will get, when plastic deformation will occur, when sigma is at least equal or greater than tau. So if sigma equals to tau, equilibrium will exist, and if sigma is greater than tau, then it will provide the driving force for dislocation motion, because sigma is provided by the external work, tau is the internal resistance. You can compare it with shear stress, but right now we have to derive the phenomenological model, so we are treating tau as state variable and see how it changes with applied stress. So the thermomechanical equilibrium, it requires that my applied stress, the sigma, is at least equal or greater than the glide resistance. And when this is greater, the dislocation motion will occur. Now mention should be made at this point that this glide resistance is not uniform throughout the crystal. Obviously, we cannot expect it to be uniform because it will change locally due to the presence of other defects or due to changes in dislocation configurations themselves. At some places, the dislocations may be lying straight. At some places, they may be forming junctions. At some places, they may be, they may be entangling within themselves or interacting with grain boundaries. There are a myriad of things that may be happening. So this glide resistance is always a local glide resistance that we are talking about. If our applied stress is greater than the average glide resistance, which is the average of the overall glide resistance in the crystal, we will expect continuous glide and continuous plastic deformation in our material. That will bring about the reference state of plastic flow. At stresses above it, acceleration of dislocations will occur. At stresses below it, thermal fluctuations will come into picture. See, if my applied stress is greater than the overall glide resistance, I don't need temperature to overcome the obstacles. But if my applied stress is greater at some places but less at other places, so at those places where the applied stress is lesser than glide resistance, in order to overcome the obstacle, I need thermal fluctuation. This is where temperature will come into picture. So now consider just that my applied stress is greater than the overall glide resistance. So what will you have is the dislocation velocity is 0 if my resolved stress is less than glide resistance, and it will be greater than 0 if my resolved stress, the applied stress, is greater than the glide resistance. As simple as that. And this is at absolute temperature, 0. When you go at finite temperatures, then the thermal fluctuations will come into picture. When finite temperature and thermal fluctuations come, then again two type of obstacles will arise. One type of obstacle which can be overcome by thermal fluctuation, but remember, not all obstacles can be overcome by thermal fluctuations. So we categorize the obstacles as thermal and athermal obstacles. I can give example like thermal obstacles are most important, and most common thermal obstacle is the Peirce stress. You increase the temperature, the Peirce stress, the inherent resistance to dislocation motion, it decreases. A thermal obstacle is most important and most common example is the forest dislocations. They cannot be overcome by thermal fluctuation. So we have the slip resistance decomposed into two mathematical components, the athermal one and the thermal one. Then therefore we have an effective stress. So talking of thermal, and because of this thermal obstacles, the dislocation will experience jerky glide and not the continuous movement between the obstacles. And where it is stopped locally at the obstacles, the thermal fluctuations should assist, or the applied stress should increase, or because of deformation, structural changes, the obstacle itself has to disappear. But when we talk of thermal fluctuations, then again another question arises as to fluctuations of what energy at what temperature, and if whether or not that fluctuation is able to overcome the obstacle in a single event or not, or how many events are required. So it is a probabilistic phenomena, it is a statistical phenomena. And what do we do when we have probabilistic phenomena occurring with temperature? We apply Arrhenius equation. So the probability for thermal overcoming the obstacle is e raised to the power minus delta G upon kBT. The delta G is the energy required for overcoming, kB is the Boltzmann constant, T is the absolute temperature. So simply just plug in this value to the equation for dislocation motion, and therefore the rate at which dislocation will overcome the obstacle is d by frequency mu and the probability. As simple as that. D by frequency of the order of 10 to the power 12. So see, from basic dislocation phenomena, we are slowly building upon to the mathematical explanation, the mathematical evolution of crystal plasticity flow. So we have now frequency at which the dislocation overcomes the obstacle. Multiply it with the average glide distance L, which a dislocation moves between the obstacles. You get the average dislocation velocity. So velocity will be L v mu e raised to the power minus delta G upon kB and T. Now you got the dislocation velocity. You can very well write the strain rate in the material. This strain rate is gamma dot alpha. It is 0 obviously. When the effective stress is 0, there is no driving force, so the strain rate is 0. But if the driving force is greater than 0, it is less than the slip resistance, you have this reference value of strain rate. This is L into V. So this is a particularly taken as constant because Debye frequency is constant, and the average distance which a dislocation moves between obstacles, that has been calibrated, and it is assumed to be a constant value. Based on that, this gamma 0 dot has arrived, e raised to the power minus delta G upon kBT. As simple as that. And this is a common form of flow rule of crystal plasticity model. Now, one question, one variable that is not much explained in detail is this delta G. What is this delta G? Consider a shear stress curve. So this is an obstacle resistance profile. It is starting from 0, and the resistance posed by the obstacles over the full length of the crystal is in this manner. It increases, then decreases, and then again it increases and then decreases, and so on. So what delta G is what? It is the activation free enthalpy. That is, it is the energy that has to be provided by thermal fluctuations. So if my applied stress sigma is less than the peak obstacle resistance, the remaining part has to be provided by delta G. So this one, the portion below SU, it will be provided by external work sigma. The portion above SU, it will be provided by delta G. This is one typical obstacle resistance profile. In this manner, we may have numerous obstacle resistance profiles, but we are talking in a general sense. Once the dislocation comes at S, it is stopped. Thermal fluctuations of magnitude delta G have to occur to take the overcome this obstacle and take the dislocation to the unstable position U, where it will glide and again come to this stable position. Again, thermal fluctuations have to occur. Dislocation crosses this barrier, again movement, and so on, and plastic deformation will continue. So delta G has to be provided by thermal fluctuations at a particular applied stress. Obviously, if I increase my applied stress to this value where we are not touching this peak, then obviously there is no need for delta G, right? So we do not need thermal fluctuations if my applied stress is of significant higher value.
Sir?
Yeah, hello?
What can be the reason for, what can be the source of thermal fluctuation?
Source of thermal fluctuation, very common temperature, sir.
Externally applied?
Yeah, externally applied temperature, yeah. Or for example, if you are doing creep deformation, then you are obviously have higher temperatures, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So it is not, the source is not within the material.
It can be within the material. For example, if you apply impact loading, so adiabatic heating due to impact loading, sir, that is also a source.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So it can be external as well as internal.
Okay.
It may or may not be intentional, because external is intentional, but internal adiabatic heating, it is not intentional. It is governed by the material.
Right.
Like we, yeah. So
Phenomenon government.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. All we are focusing is, we do not care how these external thermal fluctuations are coming. All we are caring is how these thermal fluctuations are affecting my dynamics.
Right, thank you.
Yeah. So that is the total curve. So the total energy to overcome the obstacle, that is delta F, part of which is provided by external work, delta W, and the remaining part is provided by delta G. So delta G is what? The total minus delta W. The part of delta F which is not being provided by delta W, that is delta G. That has to be provided by thermal fluctuation. So if my delta W is equal to delta F, I mean, I'm giving all the energy through applied stress. Obviously, I don't need thermal fluctuations. Delta G is 0. And if I'm giving all the, if I'm not applying any stress, then all the energy has to be provided by thermal fluctuations. So delta G is delta F. So by this simple mathematical explanation, what I get is I have a upper and lower bound of delta G versus stress curve. This is the delta G versus. Sir, yeah.
How the movement is possible in the absence of any external force and with just temperature as the source?
No, I'm not speaking of the overall. I mean, if I'm just applying temperature, high enough temperature, then I'm speaking of locally. All these phenomena that we are talking, that are local, the dislocation overcoming one single obstacle. That is quite possible. Yeah, you may not observe macroscopic yield, but inside locally at some places, yeah, this phenomena is possible. Yes, I'm not talking about macroscopic levels.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. I have to be perhaps aware of, because most people may confuse it with macroscopic level. That is quite
Yes, we
impossible
have been
to it.
listening about
Yeah,
that
yeah.
only all the time.
Yes, exactly. So that's why I spent a little bit of time earlier from this on microscopic detail. I am totally talking of microscopic level.
Yes, yes, no problem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So if I plot a delta G versus stress curve, delta G on y-axis and stress on x-axis. If delta stress is 0, delta G, the y-intercept will be delta F, because all the energy has to be provided by thermal fluctuations. And if my delta G is 0, then all the energy has to be provided by stress. So between these two bounds, various experiments and modeling techniques and electron microscopy investigations were performed in early 2000s. And this is the profile which most researchers came up with for obstacles of different nature. They may be force dislocations, they may be solutes, they may be phases. I mean, a lot of obstacles. And this mathematical explanation was derived. Delta G is equals to delta F, 1 minus tau effective stress. All these terms have been explained. T and Q, they dictate the shape of this profile, how deep or how coarse this profile is. So this is delta G, the relation between delta G and delta F. So now, because my flow rule was gamma dot is like this, gamma 0 dot e raised to the power delta G, I will simply plug in this value. And what I get, if people are present here that do crystal plasticity, this is the phenomenological flow rule of crystal plasticity models. And believe me, based on this phenomenological flow rule only, even advanced modeling techniques, advanced models which take into account the effect of dislocation densities, which take into account the effect of twins, phase transformation, dynamic recrystallization, dynamic twinning, Boltzmann-Le effect, anything, they are based on this model as the baseline. Gamma dot equals to gamma 0 dot e raised to the power delta F upon kBt, 1 minus tau upon S raised to the power T and Q. And this is called the flow rule of crystal plasticity. In the later slides, now I will show you how do I calibrate the parameters of this flow rule from MD level and pass on to the crystal plasticity level for grain boundaries. Anyway, so we have different crystal plasticity models. Phenomenological model that I have just derived, they are based on shear stress on slip systems as internal state variables. And we just see from basic Schmidt law to dislocation velocity to obstacle resistance, from those basic concepts, how we came up with the phenomenological flow rule of crystal plasticity model. And another flow rule types are dislocation density based models, which introduce dislocation densities as internal state variables. You can have another class of models like damage based models. Then you can use void volume fraction as internal state variables, and that evolves with time. But they are all based on that flow rule of crystal plasticity model. So in crystal plasticity, the essence, what are the basic ingredients of a crystal plasticity model? First, they consider the anisotropy of elastic tensor, C11, C12, and C44 for cubic materials. Then they are able to take into account of phases, different phases, phase fractions, defect dynamics, I have already told you, which is arising because of dislocation motion. This is a basic equation, Oro-1 equation, gamma dot, the strain rate in the material is dependent on rho m, the mobile dislocation density, the Burgers vector, and the dislocation velocity, rho dV. Then based on this defect dynamics, we have collective dislocation motion, that also we include in crystal plasticity. Then the crystal kinematics. This is a very important point, because this LP is where the continuum based models and crystal plasticity based models depart. The formulation of this plastic velocity gradient is written in a dyadic form in crystal plasticity models, which is not so in the continuum based models of deformation behavior. The B and N are the Burgers vector and the slip plane normal. Gamma is the shear strain on slip system alpha, and alpha 1 to 12. 12 slip systems, 5 for FCC material. For BCC, you may take it as 12 or 24 or 48, whatever. So this LP is where the mathematical framework departs between crystal plasticity and the continuum based models. Then crystal plasticity also includes the individual grain orientations. The anisotropy in grain orientations is taken into account. And finally, for polycrystalline materials. See, polycrystalline materials contains a huge number of randomly oriented single crystals, or may contain textured crystals, but they are huge in number. You cannot take that much number into account at the finite element level, even with the modern computational power. So what we do is we do homogenization techniques. Homogenization means you consider a representative volume element. You just take into account those number of grains which are the representative of the overall behavior of the microstructure. You mesh those grains, you apply load, you apply periodic boundary conditions because you have not taken into account the whole microstructure. So periodic boundary conditions are important. And then you predict the deformation behavior. So this is one simple homogenization scheme. There are a lot of homogenization schemes, but this is one simple. So this is basically the overall, I mean, the gist of crystal plasticity right from atomic level to the finite element level. Now, how this crystal plasticity, enough of theory now, because I mean, we don't want to get bored with lots of mathematical expressions. So I will simply go to the results, how this crystal plasticity simulations have been exploited to predict the deformation and failure and damage behavior of materials. This is one study on nickel-based single crystal alloy published in International Journal of Plasticity. So there was internal cylindrical voids, through thickness cylindrical voids, and how to see the plastic strains. These contours are of slip systems. So how the different slip systems are activated upon loading. So basically, crystal plasticity is able to predict the damage behavior as well into account, keeping into account the effect of microstructure, the dislocation motion. Another study published in 2019, I have tried to keep as recent references as possible. So what the authors performed is they had scanning electron microscopy images, and they saw that post-mortem deformed images showed the presence of intergranular fracture, the crack propagation along grain boundaries. So they did at the finite element level this was for Ti-64 material. And what they saw is, for certain grains, the crack may propagate in the grain, transgranular fracture. But as soon as it reached the grain boundary, say grain 2, the crack deviated for some length and then preferred to propagate in grain 2. Why? If it already wanted to propagate in grain 2, it should have followed this path only. But for this red portion which is marked, it didn't, it just couldn't cross the barrier. So what may happen is, I mean, because this is a polycrystal material, so the grain boundaries are mostly mixed in character. They may be tilt grain boundaries or they may be twist grain boundaries. So depending on the grain boundary character here, the crack, depending on the grain boundary character, this grain boundary must have offered a huge resistance to crack propagation. That's why the crack didn't cut through this grain simply, and it took this path. Although the energy required to take the straight path would have been much lower, but still the crack took this path. So we can see from the experimental observations also that the crack was trying to take a path of least resistance, and the grain boundary, because of its local crystallographic nature, somehow offered the path of large resistance, due to which the crack could not break through. This was another study, it was published in 2021 in Material Science and Engineering. This is a simple, I mean, the simple tension specimen with a hole was drilled to observe the phenomena of holes, and under cyclic loading, this is the accumulated plastic strain in the material. This is for single crystal nickel-based superalloys. So whether they are superalloys, whether these are single crystals or whether these are polycrystals, crystal plasticity-based methods are able to predict the deformation, failure, and damage behavior of materials with good fidelity, and in comparison with experiments, and also explain why the microstructural features that are observed in scanning electron microscope actually why are they happening. But these models are basically, I have explained, they are based on agreement with major mechanisms of plastic deformation, that is dislocations, and they move by slip. Now dislocations, what are these dislocations? They are line defects, and they are simply made of atoms. So in order to understand the collective behavior of dislocations, you need to first understand the collective behavior of atoms and extract the properties of single or large number of dislocations at the atomic level. Here comes the molecular dynamics simulations. And I will just quickly go through this molecular dynamics. It simulates collective behavior of atoms and through the interatomic potential. So what you do is just simply create a system, define the initial position of atom, try to calculate the forces between them. This forces is calculated based on gradient of the interatomic potential. This interatomic potential, this has come from lower scale ab initio calculations. Now they are most readily available in the literature for almost all the materials that we can find in the periodic table, or even a mix of materials for alloys like aluminum, copper like this, iron, chromium to simulate the behavior of steel. So this is just textbook. And then we solve the equations of motion, and then we move the atoms, define position, calculate forces, solve the equations, move the atoms. As simple as that. That's molecular dynamics. And this is one GIF. I have taken it from this reference, and this shows a uniaxial tension of aluminium. Initial aluminium crystal was defect free, and now you are loading the sample in along x direction, along horizontal direction, and see how the atoms change their color. The different colored atoms are basically dislocations. So how the dislocations are nucleated in the material. This is again a MD simulation of grain boundary relaxation. How a grain boundary relaxes to its stable structure. And the input to the molecular dynamics simulation I've already explained. It is the entroatomic potential. This is entropic potential takes into account the effect of bond stretching or angular bonding between the atoms, or electrostatic interactions, van der Waal interactions, dihedrals, torsional rotation. I mean, depending on the type, you want to simulate ions, you will have different entroatomic potential. You want to simulate metals, you will have different entroatomic potentials. Another critical ingredient of molecular dynamics is the time step, the length and time scales associated. You must have understood how the length scale are of the order of angstroms to nanometers in the molecular dynamics level, and consequently the time step is also at the order of nanoseconds, femtoseconds, or even picoseconds. You take a too small time step, this is the very basic physics, it may be converging, it may be not converging. Too large time step, you may miss some phenomena or instability, and therefore depending upon the computational cost and the accuracy of desired results, the suggested time step for molecular dynamic simulations is of the order of 1 to 10 femtoseconds. 10 to the minus 15 picoseconds, because of Debye frequency is of the order of 10 to the power 12. So you need to have a less time step than that Debye frequency. So we have of the order of femtoseconds. This is the basic MD algorithm. You just define the initial configuration, you set the particle positions, assign them velocities, calculate forces by the gradient of interatomic potential, update their position. Now you want to do post-processing, so you take an image, you take a movie, and if you see if you have reached the desired time step, if no, then repeat the procedure. If yes, you just halt your simulation. Because we are modeling atoms, we are not modeling bulk matter, so the boundary conditions are really important. Whenever we are not modeling bulk matter, but we are only modeling some part of it, then the boundary conditions plays an important role. In molecular dynamics, what we are more focused on is the periodic boundary conditions. So the system must be large enough so that it is not missing any detail, and it must not be small enough so that the image forces try to interact and pollute the results. So there is always a cutoff, R cut, which removes surface effects. So the shaded box represents the system we are simulating, and the surrounding boxes, because of the prevalence of periodic boundary conditions, they represent the exact copies of the simulations. And R cut is the cutoff distance between which two atoms are allowed to interact or not interact. So that is the basic phenomenon of PBCs. And in molecular dynamics, to simulate this, to simulate the behavior of atoms, we have different ensembles. We just call them like the ways to control the system temperature or pressure. So we have microcanonical ensemble, NVE. You control number of atoms, the volume of the system, and the energy. Then we have the canonical ensemble in VT, number of atoms, volume, and temperature. Or you control the pressure, which is isobaric ensemble. You control the enthalpy, it is isobaric ensemble. Mostly molecular dynamic simulations, what I perform in most, almost 50% of the world population, if it is doing molecular dynamics, they're doing LAMMPS code. It is a very popular code. It was developed at Sandia National Laboratories, and it stands for Large Scale Atomic Molecular Massively Parallel Simulator. I'm giving more details of MD because that is what this talk is about, the atomic level. So I just want to show that how and what I do in MD and what other people do in MD. So it is a very simple code written in C++. It is an open source code, can be downloaded from the website. And it is designed for parallel applications, as the name suggests. MMP, Massively Parallel Simulator. It is MPS. And it is capable of atomic, metal, polyatomic, biological, or granular systems. It is a very versatile code. And its input script is mostly ASCII format. One command per line is read, and as that command is executed, it jumps to the next step. Data files are written in the ASCII format. Cell dimensions you have to give. You define the force field parameters, define the number of atoms, bond, molecule, depending on the phenomena you are investigating. This is a typical snapshot of an MD input script. Define the metal units, dimension 3. So I am simulating a 3D structure. Boundary condition, PPP. Along XYZ, I am simulating periodic boundary condition. Atom style atomic for metals. Lattice, I am defining FCC type lattice. 3.615 is the lattice constant, so it is copper. Oriented along, X direction should be 100 crystal direction, Y direction will be 010, Z direction will be 001. Simple. So I am simulating a single crystal. I am creating a box. This is the total box dimension, and I am now creating the atoms. From this, I am defining the pair potential. EAM is embedded atom method, which is most common for metallic materials. Then I am creating the velocity of the atoms at 800 Kelvin temperature, and I am thermalizing it. This is my output frequency after every 100 time steps, and what I want in the output. This is the time step 0.001 picoseconds, means 1 femtosecond, and run it for 110,000 time steps. That's simple. We want to apply deformation, so what I simply do is fix all NVT. I'm controlling the volume and temperature of the system at a temperature of 800 Kelvin, and another fix I define, fix to all deform along x direction, engineering strain rate of 0.005 per picosecond. So that will be of the order of 10 to the power 8 to 9 per second. That is one critical phenomena that one must take care into account. The MD simulations are associated with inherently high strain rates. So that is why the problem occurs of linking the MD simulation to higher length scale models where the strain rates are much lower. That I will show in the later slides how that can be overcome. So this is our basically typical LAMMPS overview. This is simple output file, total number of atoms and atom types, box dimensions, ID of atoms, and the coordinates of atoms. Just like a finite element output file where we have a node ID and the XYZ coordinate of node. Here you can just simply treat node as atoms. And this is a type of output the molecular dynamics produces, thermodynamic output, or the dump files. And then we have different visualizers for these dump files. Atomi, Ovito, all these are open source code. So there is nothing which is held back in the atomic, the atomic scientific community, and everything is available open source. Now I will show you how these MD simulations have been used to analyze material failure and damage over the period of several years. One basic study, the first thing that comes into mind before analyzing the damage at the polycrystal level, we will first analyze damage at the behavior of single crystal level. So these authors, what they took, they created a single cubic material. The material was ductile FCC copper. They took 7 different crystallographic orientations. This is a standard stereographic triangle, which is used to represent distinct orientations. Inserted an initial spherical void, applied uniaxial tension, as you can see, and let us see how the material behaves. And these are the results. Depending on the crystallographic orientations, these authors observe the differences in the stress strain curve, and these blue atoms are all dislocation loops, how the plastic deformation initiates from the void surfaces. And for different orientations, there are different slip planes which are activated. See the different configuration of dislocation loops for different crystal orientations. And based on this, these authors at the final level of applied strain saw the evolution of void shape. See how the void shape evolves at different strain for different crystal orientations. So it is not like that in a polycrystalline material where you have a initial damage site inserted in the bulk grain. Depending on the orientation of that grain, the volume fraction and the shape of the void will be different. This study tells us this, a qualitative phenomenon. Then again, another study was performed, the effect of void shape. So these authors performed the study. They took a simulation cell, performed uniaxial tension, and they considered an elliptical void. And then the material was body-centered cubic. And now see the phase transformation during deformation, which I was speaking earlier. Because the material is body-centered cubic, and because of the initial orientations of the material, the slip systems must not have been enough to take into account the plastic deformation behavior. Hence, the phase transformation had to occur. See, here the phase transformations was reported by the authors. The local structure here changed from BCC to FCC, and then because it changed to FCC, so now we have 12 available slip systems, because FCC is one of the most simple structure where the plastic deformation occurs. And see now, based on FCC configuration, the dislocations and stacking faults existed. I mean, doing such type of experiments and post-mortem examinations at the macro level is really difficult. So that's where MD simulations and atomistic level simulations come to rescue. And this is how the void shape was evolved with strain. Now I will show the study which we did. What we did is, we took the material ductile FCC material copper, we inserted one void, and we just saw how the damage behavior changed with change in void size. However, this is a relatively simple study. The curious question was, if I keep the same void volume fraction, then depending on the distribution of void, which factor is more important? Is it the size of the largest void keeping the same void volume fraction, or is it the nearest neighbor distance between the void? I mean, what actually governs the damage behavior of the material? This was the focus of our study. And it was published in Philosophical Magazine in 2018. These are the results. This is first, I'm showing the results. If I'm increasing the initial void size, my stress strain curve is going down. That is quite obvious. I will again emphasize, please do not go this like the GPA level stresses. Do not lay emphasis on that. This, first of all, is a single crystal of copper containing only an initial void. There is no other defect. Even if you test a single crystal of copper at the macroscopic level, your yield stress will of the order of MPas, not GPas, because the initial defects must be there no matter how pure your single crystal is, or at least initial dislocation density is always present at the macroscopic level. But at the ND level, I am not considering any dislocation. See, the box is empty. All I am considering is an initial void. That is why my stresses are of the order of GPas. This is why we cannot extrapolate or we cannot translate yield stress from molecular dynamics to finite element level. All we can transfer is some other parameters which are strain rate independent. That must be always be taken care into account. That must always be taken into account. So this is one example. As we increase the radius of void, my stress strain qualitatively, my stress strain curve is going down, my ductility is changing. This is an example how the dislocation emission takes place from the void surface and how the shape of the void is evolving with deformation. However, our main phenomena is to observe the behavior of distribution of voids, keeping the same void volume fraction. In this case, it was 0.5%. So see the stress strain behavior here. Here, what we can see is the void volume fraction is same, 0.5%, but I am changing the void distribution in the material and how drastically the stress strain behavior is and the ductility of the material is changing. Even though yield is not changing much, but look the differences in the ductility, 45% for 35% and even 28% for the curves. So it is not the initial void volume fraction that governs the ductility, it is the distribution of damage in our material that governs the ductility, how that damage is distributed in the material. So what actually governs the damage behavior? Is it the size of the largest void or is it the void to void distance? So we need a statistical analysis. So we performed a global sensitivity analysis, statistical analysis, where what you do is you change one input variable at a time and you observe the effect of that, you observe the effect of change in that input variable on the output variables of interest. Output variables can be yield strength or your ductility, fracture strain, or even Young's modulus. Input variable will be void size and the void to void distance. So this is the mathematical expression of global sensitivity analysis. V is summation of Vi and all Vij's. Vi is the main sensitivity index. I is the input variable. So Vi is simply the effect of input variable I on output V. Vij, effect of interaction between input variables. Like if I'm changing the void size as well as the distance between the voids at the same time. So because this comprehensive statistical analysis was performed, which contains main sensitivity index as well as interaction sensitivity indices, we need to have an adequate number of MD simulations so that they are the representative of the whole statistical phenomenon. We almost performed 100 MD simulations for that. So our input variables were obviously that I told earlier, the mean of void size and the standard deviation, because standard deviation also plays a key role in statistical mechanics. So we took mean of diameter and standard deviation of diameter, mean of nearest neighbor distance and standard deviation of nearest neighbor distance. And our output variables of interest were yield strength, failure strain, which is significant, I mean the representation of ductility, and the void growth rate. Yeah, I forgot this, the void growth rate. How the void volume fraction evolves with time, because these are three major mechanisms. I mean, these are three major key observable variables which we also observe in macroscopic level in the experiments. To have a meaningful number of MD simulations, we first performed a large number of simulations and we observed the variance, how the yield stress and the fracture strain change with number of MD simulations. And what we saw is that around 73 to 75 MD simulations, the mean as well as standard deviation of yield stress converged almost, and that happened for fracture strain with 51 and 68. So in order to have a meaningful statistical amount of MD simulations, we generated 100 random nano configurations. 100 random nano configurations means single crystal copper, initial void volume fraction is 0.5%, but 100 different configurations of the void distribution. This is one typical example of one simulation. Here we have 5 voids. We apply tensile loading. The dislocation plasticity commences from the void of largest size. It grows, and C, also you can observe the phenomena of void coalescence. This is if you consider void number 1, 2, 3. First, initially void number 1 and 2 coalesce, and then the void number 1, 2, and 3 coalesce. So this is how damage progresses in the material with the help of plastic deformation. This is how plastic deformation aids in progressive damage behavior. Now these are the results summarized in one slide. Which factor is actually important? We have given both main sensitivity index as well as interaction sensitivity index. We will go one by one. First, observe this black solid hash line. This is the main sensitivity index of sigma y. So what you can see, this black hashed line is greater than this one, and this one, all 4 variables. So what conclusion? The mean size of void governs the yield stress. Number 1. Second, this hashed line, fracture strain, MSI, main sensitivity index of fracture strain. Mean void size governs the fracture strain. Conclusion number 2. Number 3, this blue hashed line, interaction sensitivity index of fracture strain. The nearest neighbor distance between voids. The distance between voids now control the fracture strain in addition to the void size. So tuning these parameters, we can have a significant improvement in the ductility of the material. And all these conclusions are summarized here. I will just read it out. I have written them in the most simple manner as possible. The yield strength of the material can be improved by distributing a large void into a number of smaller voids. Because large void size implies easier dislocation emission. Easier dislocation emission means early plasticity. So you want your material to have a larger yield strength, just design the material in such a way that the voids are of as small size as possible. The initial, the inclusions or the porosity, try to reduce the size of porosity. Even if you cannot control the amount of porosity, try to reduce the size of pores. Second, NND.STT is scatter in void distribution. It makes a significant impact on fracture strain as compared to other variables. Why? Because more scattering void distribution, it implies how closely your voids are spaced. If your voids are spaced more closely, there will be earlier void coalescence, now reduced strain to failure. So tuning these 2 parameters can have a significant impact on the ductility of the material. And for a given average void size, scattering void distribution makes a low contribution to void growth rate. Void growth rate is not as much important as the other output variables. And we perform additional study if we distributed the void in a regular array and in a random array, and see the results. The random array of void was less ductile than a regular array of voids. Because for a random array of voids, it is quite possible the other 2 voids are close to one another. So there will be earlier onset of void coalescence. But if you distribute the voids in a regular fashion, you may improve the ductility of your material, at least for the single crystal. So all this qualitative information, not quantitative, because the stresses are of the order of GPAs, but the qualitative information can certainly help in designing tougher and damage tolerant products. So these were these studies. Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Looks like, all these parameters related to void density and their orientation, size, looks like they can be controlled. Can you just tell us, how they can be controlled?
No, sir, see, some people, they do experiments in order to observe the effect of voids now. Suppose during creep deformation, sir, you are doing creep. Okay, take the example of nickel-based alloys. You are doing creep in nickel-based alloys. So what happens is the damage tends to nucleate at grain boundaries.
Yeah.
Now, not all grain boundaries are susceptible to same amount of damage. So, in order to control the amount of voids, I will show it later, you should control the type of grain boundaries which are present in the material. And through that, you can control the amount of voids which are produced due to plastic deformation. Via that, you can control the amount of damage in your material. So it is
within a crystal.
Within a crystal or within the material. When I am talking of grain boundaries, so it is within a material, because grain boundaries means 2 or more crystals.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay. So this is how you can control. I mean, you cannot. Yeah, I agree with you that you cannot directly control the amount of pores in your material. Yeah, that I know. But you can control The location of pores, obviously, by designing through grain boundary engineering, that is one aspect. And you can control the type of grain boundaries which are present in your material. That is quite possible. In addition, you can control the type of texture also, because I showed, depending on crystal orientation, how the void shape evolves, that I showed in the previous slides. So you just observe for what crystal orientation the void volume fraction has evolved least. Try to control that crystal orientation in your polycrystalline material. That can be easily controlled. So it is a workaround. You cannot directly control voids, but you can control all those factors which affect the growth of these voids.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. So studies on single crystals, they help to gain insight on the primary mechanisms of damage prevailing within bulk. But as we have shown, that damage is also a consequence of various defects and their interaction with grain boundaries or even voids. So next step involves, through molecular dynamic simulations, analyzing the interaction between different damage variables like crack and void, crack and grain boundaries, void and grain boundaries, etc. Again, I will first show some literature and then I will show how we have done. Now this is all molecular dynamics. We have left crystal plasticity behind. Crystal plasticity will again come in the next slides, but that will be a coupling attempt, how to link molecular dynamics and crystal plasticity, and that will be all. So this is interaction between a crack and a grain boundary. Sir, you just asked me the question, right? Now I believe this slide will also provide an answer. This is a scanning electron micrograph where we are showing that a crack is propagating through a twin boundary and how the twin boundary is aiding in crack propagation process. So what these authors did is they first observed in situ SEM and then they conducted molecular dynamic simulations and provided the theoretical framework. So now, sir, you cannot control void, but you can control the amount of grain boundaries, in this case the twin boundaries which are present in your material. So you, by controlling the characteristic of the twin boundary, you can control your crack growth advancement. This is the, so this is what, I mean, how molecular dynamics can aid in designing tougher materials, in providing information, critical information, which is necessary for designing the products. Then this was another study. This was only at the atomic level, published in Engineering Fracture Mechanics by some other authors. And what they did is they, under uniaxial, plane strain or biaxial loading, they studied the phenomenon of fracture, and they studied that the fracture is propagating through grain boundaries. So they only observed intergranular fracture load. They did not observe any transgranular fracture. Again, this may depend on the type of grain boundary. Now comes to our study. Before grain boundaries, we just studied the phenomena of crack propagation in the presence of vacancies in the single crystal only. So what we created a single crystal of aluminum. We published it way back in 2016, around 5 years back. It is a very simple study. We took a pre-cracked aluminum single crystal and we introduced different vacancy percentages, 0.5 to 5%. And we saw that with increase in vacancy concentration, the crack tip becomes blunted. See, and this is quite obvious now because now we are seeing the simulations. Initially, if the vacancies are not there, the crack will propagate through in a ductile manner through emission of dislocations. This is under a mode 1 loading. And when the vacancies are there, the crack tip will become blunt and therefore make our material tougher to fracture. The fracture toughness of the material can be improved if we have vacancies or blowholes or porosity near of a crack tip. Another study we performed, this is also our study published in Computational Material Science in 2017. Here we studied the phenomena of crack-grain boundary interaction. If you remember, around few slides back, I showed you a model where the authors saw that the crack was not propagating straight inside the grain boundary, but crack took a different path. So that portion of the grain boundary, why did not the crack took a straight path, instead took a curvy path and then propagated in a transgranular mode? So we tried to provide such answers through MD simulations. So what we did is we took the material aluminum and we inserted different types of grain boundaries in the center of crystal. So it is a bicrystal now. This crystal 1 is oriented along some orientation and the crystal 2 is oriented along different orientation. And this is the initial crack length L. Displacement, these layers indicate the type layer of atoms which are used to apply the simple tension monotonic loading. And this is once by comparison through single crystals. This is a single crystal the crack is existing, there is no grain boundary, it fractured in a brittle mode. We kept the temperature of the system so that the thermal fluctuations are not into account. So whatever is occurring is due to the presence of applied stress. Because as we have known in the derivation of crystal plasticity model a few slides back, the applied stress as well as thermal fluctuations assist in deformation. So we do not want to see what thermal fluctuations do. All we are seeing is what applied stress does. Now see the presence of grain boundaries. If the crack propagates, reaches the grain boundary, it stops there for some moment. See, the crack propagates, the drop in stress, it reaches the grain boundary, it stops there for a moment, and then it again propagates through grain boundary. Now you see, it has not propagated directly straight, it has taken a curvy path here. And this may explain why the crack in that scanning electron microscopy images a few slides back. If you want, I can just roll back, took a curvy path. It does not simply propagate directly through the skin. How beautifully
this is in mode 1 loading?
This is in mode 1 loading, yeah.
Achha, okay.
Yes. Yes, sir, yes. Another type of grain boundaries are there. In this, the grain boundary, the crack propagated through both grains in a cleavage-like fashion. Now, if I change the grain boundary orientation, the angle, crack propagates arrested at the grain boundary, but now dislocation emission has taken place. So depending upon the type of grain boundary and initial crack length, those variables we have not taken into account, but depending on the type of grain boundary, our crack can either propagate in a brittle manner or either propagate in a ductile manner, even though the temperature is same. So these type of studies, I mean atomistic studies, again, the stresses are of the order of GPa. We should not confuse with the macroscopic stress. All we do care about is how to translate these qualitative results and take useful judgments in designing our materials at the macroscopic level. And these are the stress strain curves. Yes, sir.
Sagarji, the lengths are also of the pictures that are shown. They are also a molecular lengths, right?
Yeah, the lengths are of the order of nanometers. Yeah.
Yeah, because this is similar to our CT specimen, so it might give a wrong impression.
Yeah. I am time and again pressing through this. Don't confuse. You should not.
Not your fault. Thank you.
One way to circumvent this is we have taken care of the size effects and applied periodic boundary conditions. So I mean, if you want to compare, you should not compare, but it's okay. It's fine. Yeah. And these are the stress strain curve for differently oriented boundaries. Single crystal, the black one, crack propagated in a brittle manner after the yield. Simple, stress goes to 0. For two boundaries, the crack propagated in a brittle manner in both the grains, so there are 2 steps. However, for few boundaries, the crack propagated in a ductile manner after breaking through the grain boundary. So depending on the grain boundary orientation, how the fracture behavior and the toughness of your material has changed. Even though all other variables are kept constant, the initial crack length, the system size, temperature, etc. So if I want to conclude the results of our 2 papers, I will simply read introduction of vacancies. It magnifies the amplitude of stress field at the crack tip, and therefore it will trigger plasticity evolution at a lower applied load. On the other hand, it will also help in blunting the crack tip. Occurrence of blunted crack tip means reduced crack speeds, and this reduction is more pronounced with increase in vacancy concentration. For the grain boundaries, we can see the presence of grain boundaries leads to a higher strain to fracture as comparison to single crystal. That is quite obvious because grain boundaries will act as resistance, will act as barrier to crack propagation. And some boundaries, the crack propagates in a ductile manner. For some boundaries, the crack propagates in a brittle manner, depending on the grain boundary orientation, which in control leads to grain boundary energy. So what we saw is, if the grain boundary energy is lower, you will have a tougher material. Because a lower grain boundary energy means the boundary is able to absorb the energy of plastic deformation or damage or fracture more efficiently than higher energy boundaries. So it can store more energy during deformation, and therefore it will not release it into the crystal. So you can control the amount of low energy grain boundaries in your material for robust materials for damage tolerance or even fracture tolerance. And the fracture strain in the presence of grain boundaries bears an inverse relationship with the grain boundary energy. Higher grain boundary energy, low fracture tolerance; low grain boundary energy, higher. This was another study we performed on crack void. Because we have now studied crack vacancy interaction, we studied crack grain boundary interaction. So now we have studied studying crack void interaction. So what we are doing is we are placing voids at different distances from the crack tip, same material, aluminium, and we are observing the behavior. These are just stress contours to show, just to give a feel of the fracture behavior and to validate the authenticity of MD simulations at different levels of applied strain. And these are our results. Fracture stress as a function of distance from crack tip, the distance of void center line from the crack tip. You are changing the distance, but the fracture stress will change in a sinusoidal manner. Now just imagine how many experiments will you have to perform to get to this qualitative conclusion. Again, please don't look on the magnitude of fracture stresses of GPS, just observe these sine curves. Within 2A, 4A, 6A, these are the void sizes. So with increase in void stress, obviously the fracture stress will reduce, but the sinusoidal variations remain, although with a different period, albeit with a different frequency. So it is not that it will change monotonically. The fracture stress will not change monotonically with change in distance from the crack tip and the void center line. It will change in a sinusoidal manner. So it is also important where your voids are, where your crack tip is. All of these phenomena are really important. So all this was from monotonic loading, but we are very well aware that impact loading or high stranded loading or shock loading, that is also one key loading parameter. For example, in blast furnaces or even even reactor pressure vessels or even nuclear shipping casks and DAE industries where the casks are under impact. So high stranded loading is also important. So people have performed atomistic analysis of damage under shock loading also. And this is one recently published study, Journal of Applied Physics in 2019. The material was BCC, tantalum. And what the authors did, they took a simple flyer plate target geometries. Again, I would like to emphasize all these dimensions here are in nanometers and periodic boundary conditions are applied. So, and size effects have been checked. So all we should take care is, we should see what qualitative information we are getting. We are not transferring any quantitative value from MD to higher length scale yet. We will transfer it later. So a typical flyer target geometry, this is grain 1, this is grain 2, this is the grain boundary. The authors considered different type of grain boundaries and observed the behavior under shock loading. This is one typical example. Here the perfect BCC atoms have been removed and these are the dislocations. And what the authors observed is, these are 4 different boundaries which they took, misorientation angle and the deformation mode. For 3 boundaries, the only deformation mode was slip. 2 boundaries, it was slip. Slip means dislocation motion. For sigma 129 boundary, it was twinning. There was no dislocation, only twins. But for sigma 3 boundary, prevalence of slip as well as twinning was there. And observe the void nucleation stress now. The void nucleation stress for this sigma 3 boundary is 18.92 GPa, which is higher than the spallation stress of all other boundaries. What does this emphasize? This emphasizes that in the presence of a grain boundary which leads to plastic deformation due to slip as well as twinning, there is energy dissipation mechanism in the form of dislocations. More energy dissipation mechanisms, it implies higher stress will be required for void nucleation. So control the amount of grain boundaries which leads to more slip as well as twinning if your application is intended for damage or shock loading. Because more slip and more twinning in your material during shock will dissipate more energy. So more stress will be required for spallation. More stress will be required for void nucleation. This was the conclusion. Sigma 3 boundaries are more resistant to damage in polycrystalline metals and alloys. And this has also been corroborated by various experimental investigations. These are the references for experimental investigations. These are totally polycrystalline experiments of copper, aluminium, nickel, iron. And all these authors observed that sigma 3 boundaries are most resistant to damage. And our MD simulations are confirming as to why. Because of prevalence of slip as well as twinning. Now, the next, they performed another study with a large number of grain boundaries, or the myriad of grain boundaries taken into consideration. So all these data points are each data point is an individual grain boundary, and they're plotting the grain boundary energy as a function of misorientation angle. Same flyer impact geometry is taken. Then the authors observed 4 different regimes of damage. This is very, very important. In first regime, the damage, this is the atomistic snapshot, and below is a typical, the graph. Red line indicates the position of grain boundary, and the blue lines indicate the amount of damage, the total volume of voids that have occurred during shock loading. See the regime 1. Damage is not concentrating at grain boundary, but has preferred to nucleate inside the grains. Regime 2. Regime 4 distinct regimes of damage depending on type of grain boundary. Regime 2. The damage has preferred to nucleate at grain boundary. Regime 3. Damage has preferred to nucleate at grain boundary as well as in the abutting crystals in tandem. Regime 4. Damage has preferred to nucleate at the grain boundary but with some damage in grains also. Now observe the void nucleation stress corresponding to these regimes. For regime 1, because grain boundaries did not act as the sites for void nucleation, this regime 1 is associated with a higher void nucleation stress. Now you may simply imagine by intuition that I have a single crystal, I have a bicrystal where a grain boundary is present. Obviously, the material where grain boundary is there, it will be less resistant to damage. No, this does not happen. Depending on the type of grain boundary, our damage strength may increase or reduce. See regime 1. This is a clear evidence that not all grain boundaries are susceptible to void nucleation during impact loading. See regime 1, the grain boundary did not act. Consequently, this regime has a higher void nucleation stress. Regime 2, grain boundaries preferred sites for void nucleation. This regime has a lower void nucleation stress. Regime 3, again higher because the damage also nucleated at tandem within the grains. It required a higher stress. Regime 4, at the grain boundary, lower stress. This is a very recent study, Scripta Materialia in 2020. So all these studies have pointed out how our molecular dynamic simulations can give us qualitative and very useful information in designing tougher materials and robust materials. I believe I am nearing the time. Only 25 minutes are left. So I will now just show, now this is all qualitative information, but I will also show how quantitatively our molecular dynamics can inform higher length scale models. So that will be the topic, that will be the last topic that I will be discussing, how MD can inform higher length scale models. How can information gleaned from atomistic simulations be used for informing higher scale models? There are two ways to obtain the parameters for higher scale finite element models. Either you do curve fitting or you do low multi-scale modeling, and we believe in multi-scale modeling. For bulk grains, as I already told during introduction, I was invited for the lecture in VGTI 3.5 years back, and for bulk grains, I had already presented the phenomena, how the plastic deformation behavior can be calibrated at the macroscopic level by taking information from lower scale simulations. And it was published in International Journal of Plasticity in 2018 only. If time permit, I will go through that. But right now, I will focus for grain boundaries, how molecular dynamics and crystal plasticity can be used to predict the deformation behavior of polycrystalline nickel-based superalloys 690. And this one figure will tell our methodology. What it is showing is, with the workflow is, we will have experiments, we will perform experiments, and then we will perform electron microscopy investigations. From electron microscopy, we will obtain statistics on texture. The texture means initial distribution of crystals in the material. We will have statistics on grain size distribution. We will have the statistics on grain boundary character and grain boundary character distribution. This grain boundary character distribution will go as an input to molecular dynamics level. We will see what amount of grain boundaries are prevalent in our material. We will model those in MD level. From MD level, we will quantify necessary parameters. That parameters I will show what are these and how can they be extracted, and pass on to finite element level. And finally, at the finite element level, we will perform FE simulations and comparison with the experimental data. Because without comparison of experimental, I don't think nobody in the materials or engineering community will appreciate the sense of methodology. So experimental comparison is very, very important. This study was published in recently published in Materialia. We have published in 2021. It was accepted in February or March, around 3-4 months back. So what was the first step? We will do experiments. So simple. This is a UTM machine we took. We performed experiments at quasi-static strain rates at different temperatures. And this was the dimensions of our sample for 3 mm diameter gauge section. And these are our experimental results. These are material is nickel-based alloy 690. So true stress to strain curve, the stress strain curve is going down. with increase in temperature, our stress is reducing. So this is quite traditional because thermally activated dislocation motion is occurring. So this was the experimental camp. Now next is electron microscope. So we took the initial samples and performed SEM investigations, and what we found out are the grain size distribution. So we can see that the average grain size is around 30 to 35 microns in our material, and this is the grain boundary character distribution. See this histogram. Sigma 3 and sigma 9 grain boundaries are of major population in comparison to other boundaries. So from we will take these sigma 3 as well as sigma 9 boundaries and pass on them to atomic level. Next level, take on these boundaries to input to MD model. So at the MD level, we create this sigma 3 and sigma 9 grain boundaries, because from experiments we saw that prevalence of thermally activated deformation mechanisms is there, because my flow stress was reducing with increase in temperature. So we will study thermally activated deformation mechanism, and one such mechanism associated with grain boundaries is dislocation nucleation from grain boundaries. So the type of grain boundaries that are present are sigma 3 and sigma 9 that we know from our experiments. So we model these two boundaries at the molecular dynamics level, and we perform nudged elastic band calculations to quantify activation parameters. If you remember, we have derived this flow rule. Delta F, P and Q are the activation parameters of flow rule of crystal plasticity model. We have derived this flow rule around half an hour back. So we will take these parameters delta F, P and Q. Why we can take these? Because P and Q are dimensionless. So there is no effect of strain rate on P and Q, although MDR level are at higher strain rate. And delta F, this is an energy parameter. So there is no effect of strain rate on delta F. So we are eliminating the effect of strain rate by choosing parameters in such a way that they can be transferred from MD to higher length scale. So for these two grain boundaries, we will pass on these parameters to crystal plasticity model. See, if you remember the equation now, this was the flow rule of the model, and this delta G is delta F 1 minus sigma by sigma P and Q. So if I can obtain delta G versus stress sigma curve, I can fit it to this equation and obtain the parameters delta F, P and Q, simple curve fitting. And because these are energy, the transferability is easy, and delta F, P and Q are direct inputs to the crystal plasticity model. This is simply how dislocation nucleates from the grain boundary. If you want, we can skip it, because this is simply initial elastic curve, and dislocation nucleation leads to fluctuations in the stress strain curve. And these are the results of NEB calculations. NEB calculations, nudged elastic band, they are shipped with molecular dynamics codes, and they provide a representative minimum energy path. So what you do is you calculate the energy barrier that is required to overcome an obstacle through NEB. In this case, what is the obstacle? The dislocation nucleation through grain boundaries. So see, the delta G for red is for sigma 9 grain boundaries, and black curve is for sigma 3. That is energy versus reaction coordinate. Reaction coordinate means the 0 to 1 means the reaction is completed, the dislocation is nucleated. And see, these are the saddle points corresponding to C and 3. C and 3, these are saddle points. Repeat these calculations for varying levels of applied stress. You got delta G versus sigma curve. If you remember the shape of delta G versus sigma curve, it was also same, going down, power law phi type. And here it is also same. Now you just fit this curve to this equation, get the parameters delta F, P and Q. If you remember, delta F is the intercept on y-axis. For sigma 9, it is 79.1. For sigma 9, sigma 3 boundary, it is around 98.38. So delta F, P and Q are different for sigma 3 and sigma 9 grain boundaries, and we can pass on these parameters to higher scale crystal plasticity model. What was the next step? You take all these parameter information, the texture, the grain boundary, the grain size, into crystal plasticity models, because the essence of crystal plasticity models is it can take all these phenomena into account. So this was the black one is the measured, and the red one is the simulated grain size. So we have kept it as close to the experiments as possible. The upper one pole figure is the measured, and the lower one pole figure is the synthetic microstructure that we have assigned. These are the initial grain orientations which we have assigned to our finite element aggregator. And these are the open source codes that we have used to do so. These are easily available in the literature. What is the next step? Insert grain boundary elements and pass on the relevant parameters from MD to these grain boundary elements. So to insert grain boundary elements, what we did is we created a simple Python Java program where we identified the elements which are sharing borders between two grains, and we tagged both elements as boundary elements. It is simple. You just compare the XYZ coordinates of the nodes. And so if the element is sharing a face, 2D face, but it's belonging to different grain, you can tag both elements as the boundary elements. This is a 2D representation of the concept, and this is the 3D one. Now what we observed in our scanning electron images is sigma 3 boundaries were mostly prevalent, 53%. So out of the total grain boundaries, which were 1080 in this finite element mesh, around 577 boundaries, sigma 3, around 51 boundaries, we passed on sigma 9, and rest boundaries were random boundaries. And the final step is validation. Look at the results. These results stress strain curves, if we do not take grain boundary mechanics into account. See, there are considerable differences in the stress strain behavior. However, if you consider the grain boundary mechanics with input from MD simulations, see, the results are matching quite well with experiments for stress strain curve as well as texture evolution, grain orientation evolution. This is the measured one from scanning electron microscope, and these are the predicted images from crystal plasticity simulations. And these have been published in Materialia journal. And from this also, we can also include the traditional effect of grain size on flow stress, that is the Hall patch effect. Now, because Hall patch effect is another important phenomena. With change in grain size, your flow stress will decrease. With flow stress with change, you increase the grain size, your flow stress will reduce, and vice versa. So what we did is we created 5 different finite element meshes of different grain size, 17, 34, 100, 175, and 250. We recently published it in Materials Letters around 2 months back, and see the results. Because we have explicitly included the grain boundary mechanics into account with apt input from lower scale MD simulations, our predictions of experiments, our predictions of simulations with the theory is quite encouraging. See, with increase in grain size, our flow stress is coming down, which is the traditional Hall patch effect. And this is the Hall patch slope K, sigma equals to sigma 0 plus K by root D. That is the traditional Hall patch equation. This is for, so all this tells the essence of atomistic simulations in governing the material behavior, in our allowing our judicious choices for designing good materials, and also for informing higher length scale models. Right now, we did not take any damage into account, but because now this talk is about damage, so let us see what happens if we take damage into account at the MD level. So suppose a material has some volume fraction of initial damage at the grain boundaries. What you would do is you just include damage here. Your parameters will change, delta F, P, and Q. Then you do not need to mesh or explicitly include voids at the finite element level. Your meshing will be comparatively very easier. Just an example. For sigma 3 boundary, I inserted a void of initial void volume fraction. Different void volume fractions we inserted. Same thing, tensile deformation at room temperature. Spherical void of different radius corresponding to void volume fraction of 0.5 and 1%. Dislocation nucleation will occur from the void. These are the NEB results. See how the delta G is changing with the reaction coordinates. And these are the delta G versus stress curve. Again, they are fitted to the same power law. Delta G is equals to delta F 1 minus sigma P raised to power P and Q. And see how delta F is reducing if you are increasing the void volume fraction. So now you can quantify the amount of grain boundaries in your material through electron microscopy. Observe if there is any damage, initial damage at the grain boundary. If there is, just insert that damage variable into MD simulations, quantify necessary parameters, and pass on to microstructural level finite element simulations. You do not need to explicitly mesh or explicitly create elements, because now in this microstructural finite element mesh, you put a void, your meshing will be complex for different grains, and then where to put the void. So simply, and you put these parameters, because these parameters will now be the representative of that void volume fraction which is occurring at the grain boundaries. This is the essence how MD can inform higher length scale models. The activation energy as well as these dimensionless parameters are quite distinct. For pristine means perfect as well as damaged grain boundaries, and this is how these results can benefit the materials community by serving as direct input to crystal plasticity based, microstructure based finite element models at the higher length scale. So I believe that I have given sufficient information and sufficient evidence to prove that how lower different simulations at different length and time scales can inform mechanics at higher scales. They can inform our choices to design tougher materials through grain boundary engineering or through other informations. and they also provide excellent qualitative basis for understanding the sequential nature of fracture, damage under monotonic loading, mode 1 loading, or even impact loading at lower scales, and they can be fruitful in designing materials for structural applications. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sagar. Participants, if you have any questions, you can ask him. We must all appreciate that Mr. Sagar Chandra is a graduate of the year 2011, and he has only about 10 years of service, and you can see the speed with which he is actually progressing in his research and the involvement that he has in the subject. It's really very, very surprising and very, very it is delighting also.
Thank you very much, sir, Sachin sir, and I will also like to thank you for providing this opportunity, sir. Very thank you, sir. You have my appreciation, you have my regards. Very, very thank you, sir.
Yeah, just a minute, let me ask them whether they have any questions. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Mr. Rukhande.
Yes, sir. Sagar sir, very, very interesting topic and really appreciating.
Yeah,
then some questions I felt actually finite element simulation you have done. So it is at what scale you have performed?
Micrometer. It can be performed at a millimeter scale also, but I have performed at micrometer. The dimensions of the sample are 100 by 100 by 100 micrometer cube. See, it is a representative volume element. Yeah, it is an RVE, the finite element mesh. See, this cube is around, the dimensions are around 200 by 200 by 200 micrometers.
Okay. Yeah. And then properties of the material. Means how to add that?
Yeah. This is a nickel-based alloy, right? So for nickel, we took 3 elastic constants that are available from MD simulations, and they are also available in the literature. You do not need to perform MD for that. Okay. Then delta F P cube for grain boundary elements we have taken from atomistic level, and I believe I forgot to see. For bulk grains, the properties we have extracted this using this paper. We have published in Material Science and Engineering in 2018, and there are various resistance parameters, hardening parameters, flow parameters. There are other parameters also. They can be taken from literature, or they can be calibrated also. We have calibrated them, and the results are presented in this paper.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Very nice work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sagarji, what is the type of element that was used there? Are there any special elements?
No, hexahedral, simple 8-noded elements, sir, brick elements.
Acha. And if the properties are, supposed to change from grain to grain, how do you take care of that?
Sir, if the properties are supposed to change from grain to grain, then in the crystal plasticity, we have an option of assigning different properties to individual grains. I will like to show you. See this figure. The grains are of different color, right?
Yes.
So we have at the finite element level, each element is assigned to a distinct grain, and we can assign different properties to each element which is belonging to a grain. That can be done.
I see. That must be really, time taking.
This is time taking. So we have to develop various pre and post processing codes to do that.
Okay. But it can be performed on a usual computing facility, or you require a separate, different high-speed facility for that?
Sir, these simulations I performed on my desktop computer. Although they took some time for one simulation to reach around 40% strain, it took me 5 to 6 days. Because the code that I'm using, is not parallel. However, there are now parallel codes available in the literature, and they perform this calculation in around 2 hours, 3 hours maximum.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, because you are increasing the codes now. So using supercomputer, you can perform these calculations much faster.
Right. Participants, any other question? Sagarji, I'll ask you one question.
Yes,
I am just wondering, in the qualitative molecular dynamics simulation, if supposing, it's a different question, not pretty technical, but if somebody is to review the paper, how are they to know that the things actually submitted for possible publication are in place and in line with the basic science.
Okay, sir. Okay, so if I will take my example, if I am to review a molecular dynamics paper, first of all, I will check the potential that the person has used for that material. And using that potential if the potential is supposed created for stacking photo dislocations and he is studying dislocation phenomena, then fine. Then I will see the quality, the nature of results. For example, if with increase in temperature, the stress is coming down, then it is okay. Or if the grain boundary is cracking as what we know in the experiments or what we know from the published literature, then that is okay. I mean, we have to make precise judgments based on what we know or what is available in the literature or what has been observed in the experiments. This is the only way we can observe it. Yeah.
I see. Okay. You have said that the interatomic potentials for various materials are now almost available in the literature.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. How? I mean, can you just briefly tell us what could be the way in which they are arrived at?
They can be arrived at through density functional theory ab initio calculations.
It's analytical only.
Yeah, it is analytical only. I mean, very few experiments at these level are performed, but they are mostly analytical, and they are useful to be proven. They can be proved by performing MD simulations. Suppose I create a potential for steel, so I take iron chromium potential. I create a potential for Fe and Cr. Okay, so I do some analytical calculations and I apply it on use it for molecular dynamic simulations. From MD, I will study simple phenomena like irradiation hardening or hardening due to presence of chromium. If it is matching with the experimental, if the trends are matching, my potential is okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So it is kind of indirect.
It is kind of indirect. As you go lower, I mean, direct verification is, it is quite cumbersome. It is quite difficult.
I mean, we do indirect validations at many places at mesoscales also. That's not surprising. But I just wanted to know.
Yeah. But now with the advent of high resolution electron microscopy images, scanning electron microscope or transmission electron microscope, people are gradually moving on to direct comparisons also. I have shown the slides. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would like to share one incident. I happened to talk to one of my researcher friends. He was doing some simulations about propagation of crack, starting from a notch. Okay, in mode 1, let's say, in mode 1 only, and just ahead of the crack tip, certain distance away, he created a hard spot, and then he simulated using meshless method the path that the crack will take, and the path was deviating, and it was trying to go around the hard particle, just like the water would flow around it if there is an obstruction of that type.
I got it.
He was asking me to comment, and I was completely, at a loss.
Yes,
so I would like you to make some comments about it.
In that case, what I will do is I will do MD simulation of that, because the notch is there. I can simply delete atoms. The material. I can get the interatomic potential, and in front of the crack, I will just, instead of he kept a hard particle. I will keep a rigid. I will create some rigid atoms in front of crack so that they do not break. And then simply I will just apply mode 1 loading and see what will happen.
Okay.
Yeah, things become very easy when we go at the atomic level, because you can play with the things like you want.
Yes. The only thing is, you have to be conversant first of all with the whole thing, and to get to that level, you need to consistently make efforts in that.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Initial picking up is a little, but it's okay. It can be done. Yeah.
You can start your camera now. I mean, I said that just because I thought, you may not have, you should not have any connectivity problems. You can start your camera now.
I have faced some connectivity issues in the past with my camera on. So that's why I switched off my camera.
Acha, okay. You can, switch it on now. There is some light behind you, so your image is seen only, as a skyline-like thing. Yeah.
A little blurred,
yeah. Okay. So participants, if you don't have any more questions, I would like to close the session. It is already close to 1:30 now. Any more questions? Okay. Sagarji, the topic is, something which is not usual. Therefore, if you have a question at a particular point in time, it is very difficult to go back to that point and then re-ask the question. So I thought that I'll keep disturbing you in between and then, keep asking
No,
you
sir,
things.
no problem. That's
Where-
actually fine. Nobody can remember what has
Yeah.
gone in such a long presentation. Yeah, that's fine, sir. Totally fine.
Yeah, and particularly so when you are actually listening to things for the first or second time.
No, no,
Therefore,
I completely
it is very
understand, sir.
likely that, it is very likely that there can be less number of questions from the participants to you.
Yeah, I understand, sir. Totally, it's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay, so I would actually close the session.